Okay, then I will welcome all of you to this webinar, this NORA's Friday afternoon webinar. We have received feedback that this is a good way for many of you to end the week during these very special times where so many have home offices, and we are very happy to hear that. I'm also happy to see that many of you are becoming regulars on these webinars, but you also have some new participants today. I can inform you all that also today the presentation will last for about 30 minutes. Then we will open up for questions. To all of you, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen for questions. You can write them in during the talk, and I will read them up one by one after the talk. I also want to say that if any of you have not registered to our newsletter, you should do that by going to the web pages. That is nora.ai, and there is at the upper right a link to the registration for the newsletters. You can also already actually register for next week's seminar, which will be Arnoldo Frigessi from the University of Oslo. He will have a highly relevant talk about the COVID-19 modeling, which has become an important tool for Folkehelseinstituttet and the Norwegian government these days. So my name is Claes Pettersen, and I am the CEO of NORA, and it's my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Anna Ozaki as today's speaker. Anna is Brazilian. She obtained her bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Brasilia and her PhD degree at the University of Liverpool. Anna recently joined the machine learning group at the University of Bergen as an associate professor. The title of her talk is Learning Description Logic Ontologies. Anna, the screen is yours.
Thank you. So today we are going to talk about description logic and some works on learning ontologies. Description logics are a family of logic-based formalisms for knowledge representation. It is the formal basis of the web ontology language, which is a W3C standard. Has been employed in many domain areas, in particular in life sciences. One such ontology is called SNOMED-CT. It contains terms from the medical domain. It has around 500,000 concepts. It was initially founded by a group with 9 countries, but now is adopted in healthcare systems in many other countries. And when there are new diseases, this ontology is also updated. One of the motivations for having such ontology is that one may want the terms, the names of diseases and related terms to be standard so that they can be used across many systems in different countries, even if they have different languages. So this is an example of a definition of disease and how it can be formulated within description logic. So for instance, one can say that penicillamine nephropathy is a Hano disease of the kidney structure caused by penicillamine. And that's how one would represent this using description logic. One of the advantages of formalizing concepts in this way is that one can avoid ambiguity. So in natural language, we have a lot of ambiguity. For instance, you may have penicillamine nephropathy is a Hano disease, and you can also have the whole definition. In this way, the is doesn't mean an implication, but actually you are actually defining this term, and this can be avoided when using ontologies, because you have semantics, formal semantics for this. And you have symbols that allow you to distinguish these different meanings. So this is how we would have this definition using the DL syntax, description logic syntax, in particular in EL. This is an ontology language that is behind this ontology. And one can also translate this into a fragment of first order logic, as we can see below. And the motivation for having this, studying these languages is that one can then balance between expressivity, so what you can describe within this language, and complexity of reasoning. Because when you have a language that is too complex, then computing inferences using this becomes more complex. So currently there are implementations for the EL language, reasoners, that can cope with ontologies with hundreds of thousands of concepts, such as this for the medical domain. And one can also formulate other definitions within this language. This is another example. Essentially, in description logic, there are two basic concepts that basic notions that one has in mind. So one can describe a concept, for instance, a patient with tuberculosis is a description of an entity or an object. Or one can have what is called like a statement. Let's say a patient with tuberculosis is a sick patient. And this is formulated as we see in this fourth line, and this is called a concept inclusion. So as you can see, there is a symbol that resembles the subset from set theory, and this is the right intuition. So every element that is in the extension of the left side, so a patient with tuberculosis is a sick patient. And for the purposes of this presentation, whenever I talk about description logic ontology, I mean a set of concept inclusions, so a set of expressions such as this that we see in the fourth line. The semantics of description logic is based on interpretations. So as in first order logic, so you have a domain with elements. For instance, you have the patient, and for this description, you have the patient, you have a conclusion, and you can relate the patient with a conclusion. In this case, this arrow would be labeled by the finding predicate. But this interpretation that I mentioned is useful to describe static knowledge. One may want to describe also, for instance, that after the concussion, the patient remained conscious until the examination. And actually, to describe this, one needs a temporal dimension. And there are also works combining description logics with temporal logic. And in this case, we have a temporal dimension. So we have, instead of a sequence of an interpretation, we have a sequence of interpretations representing the time. And one can also combine these description logics with other kinds of logic that represent the spatial dimension and other dimensions. One can also describe, give more precise information from when it happens. For instance, after the concussion, the patient remained conscious until the examinations 2 hours later. So these are metrics that one can also represent. And I have studied this with colleagues in a previous work where we add these metric constraints. And one can also have some kind of imprecise knowledge that can be represented. So to say that this happened from 1 to 2 hours later. So as there are many useful concepts, definition of sentences, constraints, and rules that can be represented. But of course, there is usually a gap between the expressivity of description logics as it is studied in academia and the expressivity of all ontologies. So this formalism is standardized by W3C and how this is used in practice. So for instance, in this NOMAD CT, we have this static knowledge representing several concepts, but not this temporal dimension that I also mentioned. And as one can imagine, building and also updating an ontology manually can be quite expensive. And one of the reasons for that is that in order to build an ontology, one needs to combine the knowledge of a domain expert, so someone who understands, for instance, about the medical domain or chemistry or whatever domain you are trying to model, and the knowledge about how to model this and how to represent this, all the technology involved in this. And so the name of the person that builds such kind of ontology is called an ontology engineer. And a usual process for building an ontology relies on the communication between domain expert and an ontology engineer. Now, one can see this process as an active learning process where the ontology engineer plays the role of a learner and the domain expert plays the role of a teacher. And this learner is trying to acquire the knowledge of the teacher by interacting with it. So one can see this scenario as an instance of in a model that is called exact learning. So this is a model from computational learning theory. And in computational terms, one would be interested in investigating whether there is a strategy, whether there is an algorithm that is guaranteed to learn a theory that represents the knowledge of the teacher by interacting, by posing questions. So essentially, one would represent the knowledge of the teacher, let's say here with the symbol T, and we assume that such ontology exists, that this teacher is able to answer about it, but not able to formulate it, to model this in an easy way, as it requires also knowledge about the technology behind this. And the learner here would have a hypothesis where the goal would be to construct a hypothesis that reflects the knowledge of the teacher in more technical terms that is equivalent to this ontology. And to formalize this, there are different communication protocols. One of the most popular, most studied ones is one that contains two types of questions called membership and equivalence queries. In a membership query, one asks whether an element that represents the target, whether this in this context is entailed by the target. For instance, one can imagine that we have an ontology engineer asking, does it follow from your knowledge that penicillamine nephropathy is a Hano disease? And to that question, the teacher would answer yes or no. And depending on these questions, the ontology engineer would then build the ontology. The second kind of question, called equivalence query, is one where the ontology engineer or the learner builds a hypothesis and presents this to the teacher, and the teacher will either say yes, you finish your learning, or no, and provide a counterexample, something that is missing, and then the process would continue in this way. And having these two kinds of questions in mind, one can think of a vocabulary, a set of terms, and an ontology language, and ask, what is the complexity of learning in this, within this vocabulary and this language? And the complexity here can be measured in different ways. One way is by the number of times the learner interacts with the teacher and the size of these queries, or it can also be the overall time, so counting not only the number of queries and their size, but also the time for the computation of the hypothesis. Now here in this slide, I have lots of symbols that I did not introduce. Just what I wanted to point out here is that one can define complexity classes for learning problems. So one can define the learning model, and in this way say what the learner can do, and then, depending on the language and on the particular setting that you are studying, analyze the complexity of learning. And I described here the exact learning model, but there are variants of this model, also variants in which the learner does not pose an equivalence query, but instead receives data that is coming according to a probability distribution. And I will present more about these complexity classes for learning problems in a summer school later this month. The Reasoning Web Summer School was going to be in Oslo, but now during the current situation, it became a virtual event. And interestingly, the number of participants did not decrease, it actually increased a bit for this so far, as the organizers have told me. So these are some references related to this topic, the most recent ones, the ones from this year, some still to appear. And this is some bit earlier works, where the second one was by a student called Ozaki, and he implemented a tool for one of the exact learning algorithms that we had. And there are some other approaches that have been applied, that have been proposed in the literature for learning ontologies. One of them is based on formal concept analysis, and there are also works on association rule mining, inductive logic programming, and neural networks. In formal concept analysis, so this is a data analysis method where one would look at the data and try to find the concept inclusions that hold in this data. For instance, if you look at the data and you see that every patient associated with concussion is an injured patient, then one would add to the ontology using this method an inclusion representing this. So there have been some experiments by Boschman and Gistel using the drug bank, using this approach. And these are some of their findings. The drug bank is a data set where one can see interactions between medicaments. And within these methods, one may also find not only simple relationships between concepts, but also complex ones. It is sound and complete procedure. So if you have a structure, you are guaranteed to find this, axiomatize this, so find these inclusions. And also on the good side is that the data does not need to be labeled. So in some sense, easier to apply. But there are also some difficulties with this approach as reported by the authors. The data needs to be correct, because if there is even there is a small noise, then it may not find the inclusions. And there are also some scalability issues. Now, another approach that has also been used is based on association rule mining, where one uses the measures of support and confidence. And within this approach, one can deal in a better way with noise in the data and scale, because you don't require the confidence to be 100%, and one may use this support measure to guide the search. But still, current approaches, they tend to fix the size and restrict the format of the inclusions that can be found, and that means that there are complex relationships that will not be found with this approach. So currently, we have been looking into a way of combining formal concept analysis and association rule mining. So essentially, to build an ontology where we can find these complex relationships between the concepts, but on this other hand, allow some noise in the data and also use the support measure. This is one of the ongoing works. And we are also considering how to provide probabilistic guarantees for the outcome of the procedure. Now, there is also a work by Petrucci that I would like to highlight for learning ontologies based on neural networks. In this setting, one uses to train the neural network a pair where you have a sentence, a definition of sentence. For instance, a bee is an insect that has 6 legs and produces honey. And this is how this would be represented within description logic. And use this kind of example to train the neural network. So this is an end-to-end solution. It does not need natural language processing techniques, and deals well with data variability and noise, as reported by the authors. And they also reported that one of the difficulties of this approach is that there is no data set, and it would be expensive to create one. So what they did in their work was to create all the data syntactically. And it also lacks a connection between different sentences. So they are learned in a separate way. It helps to capture, for instance, the syntax, for map the word and to what would be an and operator, logical operator, but has problems to capture the semantics. And what I would find interesting as future work would be to consider neural networks as the teacher. So there have been some works. This is one recent work where the neural network is a teacher, and you have an exact learning algorithm. So one that has this teacher, this assumes that you have this oracle. But so far, this has only been investigated for learning automatas. not in the context of when you have an ontology and you want to learn it. And the kind of neural network that would be interesting to investigate, looking at it as an oracle, are those used for knowledge graph embeddings, such as a transient neural network or some other models. And one interesting thing about this approach is that there is no assumption about the structure of the teacher. And that means one could also consider teachers that may have another formalism. And one of what we would like to do is to learn what is the internal rules and represent them in a way that we can understand what's being encoded in the neural network. Okay, so that was it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for a very interesting talk. And we will open up for questions and answers now. So please, if you have any questions, please write them in use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write in the questions. And by now there are no questions, so I will start up now. So this is very interesting, the connection you have between your description logic and ontology and the deep learning. I think, I mean, deep learning has increased much last years in use, but they lack the kind of reasoning that your ontology may have. So could you please tell us some more? What's your thoughts? How could you combine these two techniques, you think?
Yes, so I think this is the related to this last part. So one of the ways is to consider this neural network as the teacher. So we have these exact learning algorithms, and you have a way of traversing the search space, a way of posing queries depending on an ontology language. And if one would consider the oracle of the system as a neural network, we would try to learn these concept inclusions by posing queries in a systematic way.
What would actually the nodes in the neural network? I mean, could you build up a neural deep network by your ontology rules? Has that been done? This is not my field of research, by the way, so I'm not experienced at all. But is it possible to build up a neural network with ontology rules in it?
So
I mean, like the and or not gates and the logic descriptions, and connect maybe the nodes in a deep network. The nodes could be words, for example, and other layers could also, in principle, be logic operators. Has that been done?
So there has been, maybe first I could comment on these knowledge graph embeddings, on how they have been done. So because this is something that is close to how one can represent predicates, these terms. So in these knowledge graph embeddings, one represents the entities in a vector space. And the idea is to make them closer if, according to several features, they would be similar, and try to capture this. And for instance, if you have an individual that is in Norway and speaks Norwegian, and you have another individual that is in Norway, one such embedding could try to say that this other individual speaks Norwegian. So in some sense, try to take the data that is discrete and make it have a more continuous representation, so that you can make inferences. There is also some work where you have the data and you apply what is called induction by gradient descent, and is also another way of trying to build these formulas using the gradient descent.
Exactly. Yeah. So actually, the reason why I asked it is because in the brain you have these concept cells. They were found more than 10 years ago now, maybe 20, and they are concepts. So the first concept they found was Jennifer Aniston, actually. So they found a cell that was active to Jennifer Aniston, and you have all these concepts in the brain, but it's in neuroscience it's very unclear how they relate to each other and what kind of rules that kind of binds them together to reasoning. So that was kind of the background for my question. So the brain is obviously some kind of a neural network then. So in some sense also this reasoning and ontology should be built, it should be possible to build it into a neural network. So while we have been speaking now, Anna, I have received a couple of questions. So the first question is from Evgeny Karlamov, and that question is, when you discussed the complexity of the learning problem, it reminded a bit of the Kolmogorov complexity. Is there any connection between complexity of learning and Kolmogorov complexity?
I'm not aware of a clear connection between these two notions. Here, the definition is essentially you have this, what is called, if you want to go to the very deep detail on this, is a learning system. So instead of having a Turing machine, you have a pair of multi-tapes Turing machines, because you in the active learning model, you receive inputs during the computation, not just in the beginning, as it would be in a classical notion of algorithm. So once you define a learning system, you can so you have your model of computation, and you can then define your problems and also the complexity classes. So complexity class would say the set of problems that in this particular setting that let's say there is an algorithm that we learn in polynomial time, for instance. And so this can be formalized in this way, but one needs to take into account that this is not a classical algorithm, because you receive inputs during the computation.
Thank you. One more question from Evgeny. The question is, what would you consider as the main source of info from which one can learn ontologies? For example, knowledge graphs, relational tables, natural language text describing a domain, recorded interview, set of questions and answers with a domain expert, etc.
I think knowledge graphs may be it's a very interesting way, because then the data is already structured. But there are also some works starting from the natural language, for instance, this one that I presented, and there's another one in the literature, not based on neural networks, but that they also try to take sentences with a definition and come up with a logical representation of it.
Let's see, do we have any more questions now? I could also open up the microphone if someone wants to ask a question orally. So please tell us in the chat or in the question and answer panel. Yeah. I cannot see any more questions, Anna, so I will then try to just to open up the possibility for people to speak. I will allow everyone to talk, and then if some of you want to ask a question, please do that. Let's see. So then I think I have managed to open up for you to talk now.
Okay. Thank you.
No. I think there are no more questions, Anna, and if not, I will just again say thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And to all of the listeners here, please then go in and sign up also for the next Friday webinar. It will be Arnoldo Frigessi talking about this very important modeling work that they do now with the COVID-19 modeling. And this is important for Norway and important for the decision that the government is making right now. So with that, Anna, thank you very much and welcome next week to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.